Alexei and Gyro Science. Two brothers ran the Brentwood chapter of one of the most feared street gangs in America, and over a single year, that chapter was tied to 8 lives taken. Most of the people they targeted never saw it coming, and even after federal agents put both brothers in handcuffs and behind steel doors, prosecutors would argue the violence never actually stopped. It simply moved indoors, into the very jail meant to contain it. The men behind that year were brothers, and they were far younger than almost anyone expects the leaders of something this deadly to be. Alexei Saenz was born in El Salvador in the mid-1990s, and by his early 20s, he had already climbed to the top of the Brentwood and Central Islip chapter of a clique that carried a long name: the Sailors Locos Salvatruchos West Side, known on the street simply as the Sailors. Inside the gang, he answered to Blasty and to Placky, though the press would later attach a different name to him: Big Homie. His younger brother, Gyro, known as Funny, served as his second in command. For a stretch of roughly 1 year, that small cell on Long Island turned an ordinary New York suburb into a place its own residents no longer recognized. The people whose lives were taken across that year were not linked by any single thread, and that was part of what made the chapter so frightening. It began in the winter of 2016 with a young man named Michael Johnson, and it continued through the spring with Oscar Acosta. Over the following months came Marcus Bohannon, then Javier Castillo, then Dewan Stacks, and into the start of the next year, Esteban Alvarado Bonilla. Some were rivals, some were mistaken for rivals, and some simply crossed the gang at the wrong moment. There were 8 in all, spread across roughly a calendar year, each one ordered or carried out by the cell these 2 brothers ran. But the case that would define them, and eventually reach the nation, involved 2 teenage friends. They were lifelong companions who had grown up together and shared the same high school hallways. One of them had fallen into a running dispute with members of the gang, an ordinary conflict that should have meant nothing. For that, both of their lives were taken on the same day. The story of those 2 young women moved from a local tragedy to a national one, cited in the halls of government and repeated in headlines across the country, because it put a human face on what a single clique could do to a quiet town. For a while, the town lived under a quiet dread that is hard to describe to anyone who was not there. Parents changed the routes their children walked. Teenagers who had done nothing wrong learned to keep their heads down and their opinions to themselves, because the wrong word to the wrong person carried a weight no one that age should have to measure. Local police knew the gang was active, but tying specific acts to the people who ordered them was a different and far harder task. The people who could testify were often too frightened to speak, and the ones who did carried a target on their backs. It took a coordinated federal effort, the kind that pools resources across agencies and works patiently over months, to turn that atmosphere of fear into something a courtroom could act on. What the gang built in Brentwood was not chaos. It was a program. Retaliation, intimidation, and fear were the tools, and anyone believed to have disrespected the gang, or anyone who simply fit a target of opportunity, could find themselves marked. Alongside the lives taken, prosecutors would later attach 3 attempted acts of violence: an arson, narcotics trafficking, and firearms offenses to the brothers, painting a picture of a criminal enterprise rather than a string of isolated events. Federal investigators spent months building that picture, and in early March of 2017, agents finally moved in. Alexei was arrested and escorted out by the FBI in Central Islip, his face captured in the kind of photograph that tends to close a chapter. His brother was taken as well. On paper, the story looked finished. So how does a court begin to measure a single year that left this many families grieving? The answer came slowly, and it came from the federal courthouse in the Eastern District of New York. Prosecutors initially received authorization to seek the death penalty against both brothers, and the case rose so high in the public eye that the president openly called for that punishment and pointed to the case by name. In the end, the government withdrew the death penalty and pursued life terms instead. The two prosecutions were linked so that the resolution of one brother would help settle the other, and one after the other they gave up their right to trial. On July 10th of 2024, Alexei pleaded guilty to racketeering tied to all 8 lives taken, along with 3 attempted acts of violence, the arson, the narcotics trafficking, and the firearms offenses. His brother followed. On January 14th of 2025, Jairo pleaded guilty before United States District Judge Gary Brown to racketeering tied to 7 lives taken, a conspiracy in the 8th, plus 3 more attempted acts, an arson, narcotics, and firearms charges. That decision to step back from the death penalty carried real consequences for how the case would end. Federal capital cases are rare, and the government had gone as far as formally authorizing one against both brothers before reversing course. When prosecutors chose to pursue life terms instead, it meant the matter could be settled through guilty pleas rather than a years-long capital trial and the endless appeals that follow one. For the families waiting on an outcome, that choice traded the distant possibility of an execution for the near certainty of a resolution, and the resolution came far sooner than a capital case ever would have allowed. On July 1st of 2025, Judge Brown sentenced Alexei to 68 years in federal prison. Prosecutors had asked for the maximum of 70. The defense had argued for 45. The judge explained that the 2-year reduction from the government's request reflected the guilty plea, and Alexei's role in persuading his brother to plead as well. It was a rare acknowledgement from the bench that even a man responsible for this much harm had done one thing that spared the court a second trial. And it was at that same sentencing that the most unsettling detail of all came forward, the detail that gives this entire case its darkest edge. Prosecutors told the court that while he was being held in a Brooklyn federal facility, awaiting the resolution of his case, Alexei had already been disciplined for assaulting other inmates, for refusing orders from staff, and for possessing sharpened metal shanks, cell phones, and other contraband. In their filing, they wrote, in effect, that the same pattern of violence and mayhem that had marked his life on the street had not waned at all once he was behind bars. His brother told a similar story from inside. During the earlier death penalty phase of the case, prosecution filings alleged that Jairo had taken part in violent attacks on other inmates, had assaulted corrections officers, and had even tried to identify cooperating witnesses so they could be targeted for retaliation. His plea agreement set his exposure at a minimum of 40 years and a maximum of 60, with sentencing scheduled for the fall of 2025. The acting United States attorney described the 7 lives he admitted taking as barbaric, and few who followed the case found reason to disagree. As of the most recent record, Alexei Science is serving his 68-year sentence in federal custody. His brother Jairo, having entered his guilty plea, faces a term between 40 and 60 years under the terms of that agreement. Both men remain deep in the federal system, far from the Long Island streets they once controlled, their chapter of the Sailors dismantled and its leaders removed for what will amount to the rest of their lives. The Sailors chapter these brothers led was only one small cell in a structure that stretched far beyond Long Island. Above cells like theirs sat men who never had to set foot in Brentwood to decide what happened there. One of them was once described by federal authorities as the highest-ranking MS-13 figure on the entire East Coast, Miguel Angel Correa Diaz. He earned a nickname that men in his world do not hand out lightly. They called him Reaper. A former federal agent later explained that the name fit because, like the figure it borrowed from, he left death and ruin behind him wherever he moved. And for a time, prosecutors say, he answered only to the leadership of the gang back in El Salvador. Miguel Angel Correa Diaz was a Salvadoran national living in Long Branch, New Jersey, and by the time his case reached its end, he was 41 years old. According to the United States Justice Department, he had once been the highest-ranking member of MS-13 anywhere on the American East Coast, reporting directly to the gang's top command overseas. The Nassau County District Attorney described him as the man responsible for putting the gang's entire program of violence and intimidation into practice across the region. He sat near the very top of the gang structure on this side of the ocean, close enough to the overseas command that he took his instructions straight from it. Alongside a co-defendant named Junior Noe Alvarado Requeno, he controlled a cell of the Sailors Clique operating out of Langley Park, Maryland, between 2015 and 2018. That cell functioned like a business built on fear. It ran extortion schemes, collecting what the gang called rent from those it preyed upon, and it trafficked marijuana, cocaine, and heroin. The money did not stay local. Prosecutors traced the proceeds back across the border to El Salvador, feeding the same leadership Correa Diaz answered to. The drugs, the extortion, and the violence all fed a single machine, and he sat at its controls on the East Coast. The extortion was the quiet engine underneath all of it. In the territory the clique claimed, the gang demanded regular payments it called rent from the people trying to earn a living there, and refusing to pay was understood to carry consequences no one wanted to test. That money moved upward through the structure, the same way orders moved downward, and it kept the whole operation running. The violence tends to draw all the attention, but the steady collection of that rent was what funded the gang and held its grip on the neighborhoods it claimed. The crime that came to define his case began with something small. In March of 2017, a member of his clique who was hiding out near Lynchburg, Virginia, got into a dispute over marijuana with a local high school student. That dispute should have ended there, a minor conflict between a young person and a man passing through. Instead, Correa Diaz and his co-defendant organized a squad to drive down and answer it with lethal force. Gang members took the young person from his own front lawn, and his life was taken. What made prosecutors describe the case the way they did was the sheer level of control involved. They said Correa Diaz managed operations down to the smallest instruction, dictating the method by which a life was to be taken, and even how deep a grave should be dug. The United States Attorney for Maryland told the court that his brutality was almost beyond understanding, a phrase that carried weight coming from a prosecutor who had seen a great deal. What set Correa Diaz apart from the street-level figures the public usually hears about was distance. He did not need to be present for the violence he set in motion. An order could travel from him to a cell, and from that cell to a lawn in another state, without his ever leaving his own life behind in New Jersey. That distance was supposed to be his protection. It meant that catching him required more than tracing a single crime scene. It required proving the chain of command itself, showing a jury how a decision made by one man became an act carried out by others hundreds of miles away, and connecting the money and the drugs and the lives taken into one enterprise with him at its head. He did not begin the case in an American courtroom at all. Drug Enforcement Administration agents brought him into the country, landing in Baltimore in April of 2018, and from there the prosecution began the long work of building toward trial against a man the gang had gone to great lengths to protect. What does it take for a jury to reach the top of an organization built to keep its leaders untouchable? It took 4 weeks. In a federal courtroom in Greenbelt, Maryland, the government laid out the structure of the enterprise, the drugs, the money crossing borders, and the lives taken on command. Witness by witness, the case moved from the streets of Langley Park to the leadership overseas, tying Correa Diaz to acts he had ordered rather than carried out with his own hands. On November 23rd of 2021, the jury convicted him on every front that mattered. The verdict covered racketeering conspiracy, a conspiracy to take a life in aid of racketeering, the taking of a life in aid of racketeering, a drug conspiracy, and heroin distribution. Nothing of significance was left unproven. His defense attorney urged the court toward a term of no more than roughly 21 years and 2 months, arguing for a limit on what his client should face and pointing the judge toward mercy. The judge did not come close to that request. On April 1st of 2022, United States District Judge Paula Shinas sentenced Miguel Angel Correa Diaz to life in prison, closing the book on a man who had spent years directing violence from a position he believed placed him beyond the reach of American courts. As of the current record, Correa Diaz remains in federal custody, serving that life sentence with no path to release. The man once said to sit at the very top of MS-13 on the East Coast now occupies a cell like any other inmate. His authority stripped away by the same federal system he spent years trying to stay ahead of. If Correa Diaz represented the command that gave the orders, the next man shows what those orders looked like when they landed on a single Long Island clique, and on the ordinary people unlucky enough to cross it. Heriberto Martinez. A young mother in Central Islip was lured out on a winter day and never came home, and neither did her small child. The man who authorized it was not much older than the people he commanded. He led a clique of MS-13 that treated its own rules as more important than any human life, and before investigators were finished, his name would sit at the center of 3 separate lives taken across barely 6 weeks. Heriberto Martinez was a Salvadoran national, and at the time his case closed, he was 26 years old. He led the Coronados clique of MS-13 on Long Island, and he carried the gang name Boxer. He was young, but within the clique, his word functioned as law, and the men beneath him carried out what he decided. In the early months of 2010, over a stretch of only weeks, the violence he directed moved through several communities at a pace that stunned even seasoned investigators. The first act came on the 5th of February. Martinez authorized the execution of a 19-year-old woman, Vanessa Argueta, whom he believed had shown disrespect to the gang. She was lured out, and her life was taken in an execution carried out on his order. The same incident also took the life of her young son, a crime for which Martinez was later convicted as an accessory after the fact. He then helped the shooters flee the country to El Salvador, moving them beyond the reach of local police before the investigation had even begun. Weeks later, on the 6th of March, a security guard named Nestor Moreno, 23 years old, lost his life at a bar and grill in Hempstead. Martinez had been pepper-sprayed during a dispute over a bar tab, a petty argument by any measure, and he had vowed the matter would not end that way. It did not. And on the 17th of March, a fellow MS-13 member named Mario Alberto Canton Quijada was fatally harmed in Far Rockaway, Queens, for the offense of refusing to do the gang's work. The violence reached the gang's own members too, turning inward whenever one of them stepped out of line. The United States attorney overseeing the case said Martinez placed less value on a human life than he did on enforcing the barbaric rules of his gang, and that he had authorized the execution of a young mother simply because he believed she had disrespected him. It was a characterization built directly from the facts the jury would hear. How do you seat a jury to try a man whose organization is known for reaching witnesses long before they ever testify? The government's answer was an anonymous jury, and it became one of the defining features of the case. Martinez stood trial alongside a co-defendant known within the gang as Silencio, in a federal courtroom in central Islip, under a sweeping racketeering prosecution presided over by United States District Judge Joseph Bianco. The trial ran 6 weeks, an unusually long stretch that reflected the scale of the enterprise the government was trying to prove. On March 21st of 2013, the jury convicted Martinez on all counts, including racketeering conspiracy, the taking of a life, assault with dangerous weapons, and firearms and conspiracy offenses. Every charge the government brought landed. The decision to shield the jury was not a small procedural footnote. It reflected a hard reality that prosecutors on Long Island had come to understand about cases like this one. A trial only works if the people asked to render a verdict can do so without fear for their own safety, and the gang's willingness to reach beyond its immediate enemies made ordinary jurors feel exposed. By keeping their names and identities hidden, the court removed one of the gang's most effective weapons, the ability to intimidate the very system meant to hold it accountable. It was a signal that these prosecutions would be carried out on the government's terms, not the gang's. On December 9th of 2013, Judge Bianco sentenced him to life in prison plus 60 years. Some accounts describe the term as 3 separate life sentences stacked on top of the additional 60. Either way, the meaning was the same. Martinez would not leave federal custody. He did not accept the verdict quietly. He appealed, and in 2016, a federal appeals court upheld both his conviction and his sentence. His central argument challenged the use of the anonymous jury, claiming it had unfairly prejudiced him in the eyes of the jurors. The court rejected that argument. It found substantial evidence that co-defendants in the broader case had tried to interfere with the judicial process, which more than justified protecting the identities of the people asked to judge them. The very reputation the gang had built for reaching witnesses became the reason its members lost that appeal. As of the current record, Heriberto Martinez remains in federal prison, serving a sentence of life plus 60 years. His conviction affirmed on appeal and no route to release before him. Martinez led the Coronados clique when those lives were taken, but he was not the first man to hold that position. The clique had a leader before him, one whose own case reached back to the very beginning of that violent chapter on Long Island. José Gustavo Orellana Torres. A man was walking through a Long Island neighborhood one night, part of no gang, tied to no dispute, when a car slowed beside him. The people inside did not know him. They had decided, based only on the color of his skin and the street he happened to be on, that he must belong to a rival gang. He did not, and that assumption cost him his life. José Gustavo Orellana Torres carried the gang name Diablito, which translates to Little Devil, and at the close of his case he was 28 years old. Before Heriberto Martinez ever led the Coronados clique of MS-13, Orellana Torres held that same command. He was, in a sense, the man who set the tone for the chapter that Martinez would later inherit. His case reached back to the spring of 2009, and it centered on a single act of senseless, mistaken violence that captured everything wrong with how the gang operated. On the 26th of May, 2009, in central Islip, Orellana Torres and other members of the gang encountered a man named Dexter Achiampong. They did not know him. They had never spoken to him. Based purely on his appearance and the neighborhood he was walking through, they assumed he belonged to the Bloods, a rival to their own. In truth, Achiampong belonged to no gang at all. He was simply a man walking home. Orellana Torres stepped out of the car and fired 4 shots from a .38 caliber revolver, striking Ashiampong twice in the back as he tried to flee. His body was found the next morning in a driveway on East Maple Street, discovered by people who had no idea a stranger's assumption had ended a life on their block. Weeks later, on the 5th of July, the gang attempted to take the life of a suspected rival in Roosevelt, New York, another act that would be folded into the case against him. An official with the FBI later described the gang bluntly as a violent horde that left bodies in its wake, dismissing any idea that it stood for something as noble as ethnic pride. Was a man's life really taken over nothing more than a stranger's guess about where he belonged? That question hung over the case as it moved through the federal system. Rather than face a jury, Orellana Torres chose to plead guilty. On the 25th of September, 2012, he admitted to racketeering, with predicate acts that included the life taken in Central Islip and the attempted taking of a life in Roosevelt. By pleading, he avoided the kind of drawn-out trial that men like Martinez would later face, but he did not avoid a serious sentence. The prosecution was handled by a team of assistant United States attorneys, several of whom would go on to prominent careers at the highest levels of law enforcement, a measure of how seriously the government took these Long Island cases, even in their early years. On June 28 of 2013, United States District Judge Joseph Bianco, the same judge who would later sentence Martinez, sentenced Orellana Torres to 365 months in federal prison. That is a term of 30 years and 5 months. It was shorter than the life terms handed down to some of the others, but it removed him from the streets for the bulk of his adult life, and it marked the formal end of his time leading the clique. His case matters for more than its own outcome. It came early in a long series of federal prosecutions aimed at MS-13 on Long Island, at a time when the gang still believed the neighborhoods it operated in were beyond serious reach. The care the government put into a case built partly on an act of blind, mistaken violence sent a message that would echo through the cases that followed, including the one against the man who inherited his clique. The pattern was set here. Identify the leadership, prove the enterprise, and remove the people at the top one by one, whether they pleaded guilty or fought to the last. As of the current record, José Gustavo Orellana Torres remains in federal custody, serving that sentence of just over 30 years. He led the Coronados clique before the man who followed him carried its violence further, and both men now sit inside the same federal system, the Long Island chapter they each commanded closed for good. These 4 men belong to the same stretch of the gang's map, the Long Island cliques and the East Coast Command that fed them. But MS-13 was never bound to a single region. It followed its members wherever they traveled, and in the cases ahead, the violence spreads outward into Virginia, Massachusetts, Maryland, and as far west as Colorado, carried by men who climbed the ranks, one act at a time. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Elmer de Jesus Alascandre, 6 lives, 2 states, and 4 years of violence that earned one young man a promotion in his gang each time he took part. The leaders in these cases often kept their distance from the act itself. This one did not. And by the time federal prosecutors were finished, the record against him read less like a criminal history than a map of everywhere the gang had reached. Within MS-13, taking part in an act of violence is one of the main ways a member climbs, and few climbed the way this man did. Elmer de Jesus Alascandre, who also went by the name German Alexander Ramirez Lopez and the gang names Buki and Desquiciado, was a Salvadoran national and a member of the Uniones Locos Salvatrucha clique of MS-13. At the close of his case, he was 27 years old. Over roughly 4 years, he took part in 6 separate lives taken across Massachusetts and Virginia, and each one lifted him higher in the gang's ranks. The first came on August 25th of 2018 in New Bedford, Massachusetts. The gang's leadership back in El Salvador had decided that a man tied to a rival clique had betrayed them, and they approved his death from across the ocean. Alaskandre and other members met the man at a fellow member's home, shared a meal with him, and then took his life. His remains were concealed and buried in a wooded area outside the city. For their part in it, the men involved, Alaskandre among them, were promoted within the gang. That was the pattern, and it would repeat. From there, the violence moved south. In June of 2019, he and others conspired against people who gathered to drink in a wooded area the clique claimed as its own near Reston, Virginia. Over the next 3 years, the toll climbed through the suburbs of Northern Virginia. Prosecutors would eventually tie him to a series of lives taken in and around Reston and Fairfax County, each victim marked for the same familiar reasons: a suspected rivalry, a perceived slight, a gang rule someone was believed to have broken. Some of the victims were identified in court only by their initials, men whose paths had crossed the clique at the wrong moment. By the time the full accounting was done, the number stood at 6. The last stretch of that violence, in the spring of 2022, showed how routine the brutality had become for the clique. Its members treated a corner of the Northern Virginia suburbs as their own ground, and they patrolled it the way soldiers patrol a border. They moved through the footpaths and apartment complexes around Reston, looking for anyone they decided did not belong, and once they settled on a target, the outcome was rarely in doubt. One man was taken from the area and driven to a park in Fairfax County, singled out because the clique had convinced itself he had disrespected the gang and broken its rules. What connected these incidents was not a single master plan so much as a shared conviction, a belief that the clique held the authority to decide who was allowed to exist in the spaces it claimed. That belief and the rewards that reinforced it became central to how prosecutors explained the case. Inside the gang, a member's standing rises with what he is willing to do, and taking part in an approved act of violence is among the fastest ways to climb. It gave the government a motive that reached across all 6 of the lives taken, a single thread of ambition running through years of otherwise separate crimes. The investigation that documented that thread was the product of a federal task force built to dismantle organized drug and gang enterprises, one that pooled the resources of several agencies over a long stretch of time. Their work turned a scattered set of incidents into one coherent account of an enterprise and the man who kept rising through it. What held all of it together, in the eyes of the law, was not 6 separate crimes, but one enterprise. The lives taken, the promotions that followed them, the drugs the clique moved, and the territory it defended were all part of a single operation, and that was the frame the government would use to bring the whole of it before a jury at once. Building that frame took years of patient work, pulling together acts committed in different states at different times and showing the through line that connected them. How does a case built on lives taken in 2 different states, some of them years apart, ever come together in a single courtroom? The answer was a federal racketeering prosecution in the Eastern District of Virginia, the kind of case designed to gather scattered acts under one enterprise and try them together. On October 21st of 2024, a federal jury convicted him. The verdict covered conspiracy to participate in a racketeering enterprise, 5 counts of conspiracy to take a life in aid of racketeering, 5 counts of taking a life in aid of racketeering, and 3 counts of using a firearm during a crime of violence that caused death. The United States Attorney for the district called the case a stark reminder of the violence and the disregard for human life woven through the gang's enterprise, and pointed to the narcotics it moved and the lives it took as 2 halves of the same machine. On January 30th of 2025, United States District Judge Michael Nachmanoff sentenced him to 6 concurrent life terms, along with additional years. 1 life sentence for each life he had taken. A co-defendant who took part in that first act in New Bedford, a man who carried the gang names Kusuko and Lil Player, received a term of 50 years for his own role in 3 of the deaths. The sentences closed a case that had stretched across 2 states and the better part of a decade. Cases like his are rarely won without insiders. Much of what prosecutors knew about the 6 lives taken came from people who had once stood inside the clique and later agreed to describe it from the witness stand, trading their own exposure for a measure of leniency. Their accounts, matched against physical evidence and the gang's own habit of rewarding violence with rank, let the government show not just that the acts had occurred, but that Alice Condré had been part of them. It is a slow way to build a case, and a fragile one, because witnesses can be frightened into silence. That it held together across 6 separate acts was itself a measure of how thoroughly the enterprise had been penetrated. As of the current record, Elmer de Jesus Alas Condré is serving 6 life sentences in federal custody, with no prospect of ever being released. The promotions he earned through 4 years of violence bought him a permanent place inside the system that finally stopped him. That first death in New Bedford turned on a quiet cruelty that ran through many of these cases, the way a shared meal or a friendly invitation could be used to put a target at ease before the gang closed around him. In Maryland, that same tactic took an even more deliberate shape, in an act of violence that had been planned for 2 full weeks before the victim ever arrived. Miguel Angel Lopez Abrego. For 2 weeks, a group of MS-13 members planned a single evening down to the smallest detail. They dug a grave in a Maryland park before their target ever knew he was one. They spoke to each other over walkie-talkies as he arrived, expecting a party. What they had actually arranged was the end of his life, and it would be months before anyone could even say his name. The planning was what set this case apart. Nothing about it was sudden or impulsive. The grave came first, dug and waiting in the woods, and everything else was arranged around it. The victim was a young man, lured from the Annapolis area of Maryland with the promise of a gathering. The gang had come to suspect that he was passing information about them to rivals through a woman he was seeing, and for that suspicion, as many as 10 members arranged his death. On the evening of March 31st of 2017, the group carried out what it had spent 2 weeks preparing. Miguel Angel Lopez Abrego, who was 19 at the time and carried the gang name Timido, helped dig the grave, kept watch with a radio, and was later described in court as the first to strike. The young man's life was taken there in the park, and his body was placed in the grave that had been waiting for him. For a long stretch afterward, no one came forward with a name investigators could trace, and the victim lay unidentified. The case broke open through an informant. In September of that year, a member of the gang led detectives to a wooded area of Wheaton Regional Park in Montgomery County and described what had happened there. On September 5th, officers found the grave. The victim was still unidentified, noted only as a young man of slight build, last seen in a sweatshirt from a church in Laurel. It was a detail that spoke to how completely the gang had erased him, a person reduced in the record to a description and a set of initials. Lopez Abrego, by then, had already slipped away. Detectives had actually crossed paths with him once before, weeks earlier during a traffic stop, and he had denied any part in the crime. By the time they went looking again, he was gone. He surfaced in early November in the mountains of Avery County, North Carolina, where United States Marshals and local deputies found him hiding inside a condominium alongside two other wanted members of the gang. He was arrested, extradited to Maryland, and charged. There was a grim accident to how he was found. Federal marshals had actually been hunting a different member of the gang, a man wanted for a separate act of violence in another Maryland county, and the trail led them to a condominium in the North Carolina mountains. When they arrived, they found not one fugitive but three, all recent arrivals, all wanted back in Maryland, hiding together far from the neighborhoods they had left behind. Lopez Abrego was among them. A community that had never heard of these men, as the local sheriff put it, had unknowingly taken in people carrying warrants for some of the worst violence the gang had committed. How do you win a conviction for a life taken when, for years, you cannot even say whose life it was? The case became part of a sweeping federal prosecution out of the District of Maryland. A superseding indictment named more than 20 members and associates of MS-13 cliques operating in the state, tied together under a single racketeering conspiracy responsible for at least 6 lives taken, 5 more attempted, and a long list of other crimes. Rather than take his chances at trial, Lopez Abrego pleaded guilty to racketeering conspiracy, admitting his role in the crime at the park. His plea became one of many in that case, a steady procession of gang members trading trials for certainty as the government worked through the indictment name by name. There is a reason a single suspicion could end in a grave dug 2 weeks in advance, and it lies in the rule the gang was enforcing. Among the oldest laws of MS-13 is a demand for silence toward the police, a principle the gang sums up in a phrase that means, in effect, see, hear, and say nothing. A member thought to have broken that rule, to have spoken to law enforcement or leaked information to rivals, could have a green light placed on him, an internal order marking him for death that any member was expected to help carry out. The young man lured to the park had fallen under exactly that kind of suspicion. Whether it was actually true, almost did not matter. Once the gang decided he had talked, the machinery of its own rules took over, and the outcome was close to inevitable. His case was never really about one grave in one park. It was one thread in a years-long federal effort to pull an entire network of Maryland cliques into a single racketeering prosecution, an enterprise the government tied to at least 6 lives taken and a long list of other violence. As investigators worked through that structure, member after member chose to plead rather than gamble on a trial, and the sentences piled up across 2 years. Lopez Abrego's term would become one entry in a much longer ledger, a case the government closed one name at a time until the clique that had operated so freely was effectively gone. On February 21st of 2020, in federal court in Baltimore, Chief United States District Judge James Bretter sentenced him to 25 years in prison. The judge, agreeing to a term that prosecutors and the defense had jointly recommended, described the crime as unspeakable in its violence. By then, Lopez Abrego was 22 years old. Co-defendants who had taken part in the same crime were sentenced separately, several to terms far longer, as the same investigation closed one case after another. As of the current record, Miguel Angel Lopez Abrego is serving his 25-year federal sentence. The young man he helped bury in that park was eventually given back his name, but for the people who loved him, the answer arrived only after a long silence the gang had engineered on purpose. For close to a year, he existed in the record as little more than a description and a set of initials, until the patient work of matching missing person reports against the accounts of cooperating gang members finally restored his identity. Too late to matter to him, but not to the family that had spent that year without an answer. Lopez Abrego was one of 10 sets of hands in that park, a foot soldier carrying out a plan that had been set above him. The men who set those plans, the ones whose word could send a squad hunting through a neighborhood, sat far higher in the gang. One of them held a rank that most members never come near, a leader whose authority reached clear across the country. Edenilson Velasquez Larin. A traffic stop on an Ohio highway ended the run of a man federal prosecutors would describe as a national leader of MS-13. He had been living quietly, far from New York, where the orders he was accused of giving had already cost at least 4 lives. The state troopers who pulled his car over that day may not have grasped who was sitting inside it. Federal authorities had been looking for him for a very long time. The rank prosecutors described sat near the very top of the gang. From a position like that, a single man could reach down into cliques in other states and set their violence in motion with little more than a word. Edenilson Velasquez Larin, known within the gang as Aggressor and by several other names, was cast by federal prosecutors as a national leader of MS-13 and a head of the Fulton Locos Salvatruchas clique. He was in his early 30s. For years, he had moved around the country, from New York to Colorado and eventually to Ohio, while the cliques he oversaw carried out his instructions back east. He rarely needed to be anywhere near the violence he directed. A message was enough. Prosecutors traced a series of acts back to his command. In 2016, a young man named Kenny Reyes lost his life in a machete attack the gang carried out. In November of 2018, a 20-year-old named Victor Alvarenga was fatally shot near his home in Flushing, Queens. In 2020, the gang took the life of a man named Eric Monge, and in 2022, another man, Oswaldo Gutierrez Medrano, was fatally harmed in a second machete attack. 2 more men, referred to in the indictment only as unnamed victims, survived attempts on their lives. In each case, prosecutors said, Velasquez Larin had either ordered the act outright or set in motion the hunt that led to it. One of his orders, they said, sent gang members combing an Elmont neighborhood in search of rivals they believed were pushing into the clique's territory. The prosecution sat within one of the longest-running campaigns against MS-13 anywhere in the country. For more than 2 decades, federal prosecutors in the Eastern District of New York had been convicting the gang's members, and over the years, their office had charged the local cliques in connection with dozens upon dozens of lives taken across the district. Velasquez Larin represented a specific kind of target within that long effort. Catching a leader proved harder than catching a street soldier because his exposure depended on proving what he had directed from a distance rather than anything he had done with his own hands. That meant reconstructing the chain of command itself. Prosecutors had to show a jury how an instruction could pass from a national figure down through clique leaders and finally reach the young men who carried it out on a street corner. It was slow, painstaking work, built on cooperating witnesses who had lived inside the structure, on intercepted communications, and on the gradual assembly of a hierarchy most outsiders never see. The 4 lives at the center of the case were the evidence of what that hierarchy could do once it settled on a target, and the 2 men who survived attempts on their lives were proof that the gang did not always finish what it began. His capture came almost by chance. In the summer of 2023, Ohio State troopers stopped a car on the turnpike and found him inside. A federal indictment running to dozens of counts had already been unsealed in the Eastern District of New York, naming him alongside more than 20 others. He was in immigration custody at the time, and from there, the long process of bringing him to trial began. For years, he had operated under a string of names, shedding one identity for another as he moved between states. And that constant reinvention was part of why locating him had taken as long as it did. It was a fitting end to years of movement. A man who had crossed the country to stay ahead of the case finally stopped on an ordinary stretch of road. How do you prove that a man hundreds of miles away, a man who never touched a weapon, was the reason 4 people did not come home? The government's answer was a 10-week trial in federal court in Brooklyn, before United States District Judge LaShanne D.R.C. Hall. Prosecutors laid out the structure of the enterprise and the chain of orders that ran through it, connecting Velasquez, Larin, and 3 co-defendants to the violence carried out in their names. In December of 2025, the jury returned its verdict. He was convicted on 24 counts, including racketeering conspiracy, running a continuing criminal enterprise, 4 counts of taking a life in aid of racketeering, 2 counts of attempting to take a life, a drug conspiracy, money laundering, and firearms offenses. 2 other men described as national leaders, along with a clique member, were convicted alongside him. Under the charges the jury returned, the sentence is not left to a judge's discretion. Each of the 4 lives taken carries a term the law fixes at life in prison. Federal officials described the verdict as the end of the bloody reign of 4 dangerous men, 2 of them among the gang's national leadership, and framed it as a warning to anyone who believed that giving orders from a distance placed them beyond reach. He did not fall alone. Convicted alongside him were another man federal prosecutors described as a national leader, known within the gang as 21, and 2 figures from the Fulton clique, one of them a clique leader, and one a member who had taken part in the violence directly. Prosecutors framed the verdict as the simultaneous end of 4 careers built on bloodshed, and as proof that rank offered no protection. The men at the top, they argued, were now answerable for the very same acts as the young soldiers who had carried out their orders on the street. As of the most recent record, Edenilson Velasquez Larin stands convicted and awaits formal sentencing, facing a life term the law requires. The rank that once let him direct violence across state lines has become the very reason he is unlikely to ever leave prison. Velasquez Larin had spent time in Colorado himself, one of the places the gang had drifted as it pushed west from its older strongholds. That drift is the thread into the final case, set in a Denver suburb where MS-13 tried to plant itself, and where a single member left a trail of violence across just a few months in 2019. Mauricio Alvarado Vasquez. In the span of a few months in 2019, a suburb of Denver became the testing ground for a gang trying to move in. A woman was lured from a bar and driven away, and her life was taken. 6 people were later wounded in a single burst of gunfire at an apartment complex, and not one of them had any tie to a gang at all. The man at the center of much of it would later boast, prosecutors said, about how little the lives he took had meant to him. What made those months so frightening was how arbitrary the violence had become. The gang did not need a genuine rival to act on. A rumor, a passing look, a wrong assumption traded at a bar could be enough to mark someone. Mauricio Alvarado Vasquez was a Salvadoran national and a member of MS-13, living in the Denver metropolitan area, and at the close of his case he was 31 years old. He was part of a push by the gang to establish itself in Colorado, far from its footholds on the coasts. And over a few months in 2019, he became the center of a string of violence that ran across the Denver suburbs. The first act came on September 8th of 2019. A woman named Vicky de Dios, whom the gang wrongly believed to be connected to a rival, was lured from a bar, overpowered, and driven away. Her life was taken, and the vehicle she had been in was later found burning on the shoulder of Interstate 225, an attempt to destroy whatever the scene might reveal. Weeks later, on the 2nd of November, a man named Carlos Ramirez Rivera was fatally shot as he sat stopped at a red light, targeted for the same reason as the others, a suspected rivalry that existed mostly in the gang's imagination. Between September and October, the gang had also plotted against another man, Alexander Portillo, studying his schedule and his car in order to ambush him. He survived. And on the 11th of November, gunfire tore through an apartment complex on South Ironton Street in the early morning hours. 6 people were struck and wounded. They had been labeled rivals by the gang while out at a bar, though not one of them carried any gang tie at all. The discovery of the first victim set the tone for everything that followed. Firefighters had been called out for a vehicle burning on the shoulder of the interstate, what looked at first like an ordinary car fire on an ordinary morning. Only after the flames were out did they find someone inside, in the back of the car, a woman who would be identified as Vicky de Dios. What had been arranged to pass for an accident turned out to be the opening act of a coordinated campaign, and it took investigators time to understand that the burning car on the highway belonged to the same story as the shootings that came later. Tracing that connection was the first thread they pulled, and it slowly drew the rest of the case into the light. Prosecutors placed Alvarado Vasquez at the center of the violence, and one of them told the court that he had boasted about his part in the woman's death, treating a human life as something to gloat over afterward. A district attorney who oversaw the broader case called MS-13 one of the most violent and brutal gangs he had encountered in his career, and credited the state and federal officers who spent years untangling it. The picture that emerged was of a group willing to take a life on the thinnest of pretexts, and to celebrate it once it was done. Part of what made the case against him so strong was how much of the planning had been written down. In arranging the attempt on Alexander Portillo, gang members had traded messages on Facebook and other apps, working out his schedule, his employer, and the kind of car he drove so they could time an ambush. Those digital trails did not vanish. They sat in servers and on phones, waiting to be pulled into evidence, and they showed a jury a level of deliberation that was hard to argue against. A crime committed in a flash of anger is one thing. Deliberation spelled out in writing over days is far harder to wave away. The apartment complex shooting sharpened the fear that had settled over the area. The 6 people wounded that morning had done nothing to invite it. They had simply been out at a bar and had been marked, on no real evidence, as belonging to a rival gang. That was the quality that made this stretch of months so unsettling to the people who lived through it. The violence did not follow the logic of a feud between known enemies. It could fall on anyone the gang decided to suspect, which meant it could fall on nearly anyone at all. When prosecutors later spoke of a community pushing back, that fear was the thing they were describing, the sense that safety had come to depend on a gang's passing assumptions. How many lives does a gang get to touch before a community that never asked for any of it manages to push back? In Colorado, the answer came through the courts, rather than a single dramatic arrest. More than a dozen people were charged with gang-related crimes tied to that stretch of 2019 and into the following year. Alvarado Vasquez went to trial, and it lasted 4 weeks. Investigators had already spent hundreds of hours on surveillance footage and interviews, piecing the separate incidents into one connected case, showing how a car fire on a highway and a shooting at a red light and a burst of gunfire at an apartment complex all traced back to the same small group. In July of 2023, a jury convicted him, He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the most severe term the court could impose. His convictions covered the life taken from Vicky de Dios, the life taken from Carlos Ramirez Rivera, the attempt on Alexander Portillo, and the apartment complex shooting that wounded 6. An accomplice in the woman's death received the same sentence, life without parole. In all, 16 gang members were prosecuted in the broader case, the last of them sentenced before the year was out, closing the book on the gang's brief and violent bid for a foothold in the region. As of the current record, Mauricio Alvarado Vasquez is serving life without the possibility of parole in the Colorado State prison system. The gang's attempt to establish itself in the Denver suburbs collapsed under the weight of those prosecutions, and the man who had done so much to drive its violence will not leave prison for the rest of his life. Every name in this account ended in the same place, inside a prison system that outlasted whatever power the gang had once handed them. Different cliques, different states, different years, and the same quiet closing of a cell door. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.